going to kind of pick up where we left off last week. I did want to address one comment that Donna had asked a question at the end of the last class about our right that was recognized by the Second Amendment, and asked about bombs and planes and all that kind of stuff. And I want to answer that by saying this, since I didn't have a lot of time then to address it, that I do intend to address that when we're through with this. But on a larger issue, one question that I'd want to ask back is, what was the purpose for our founders to put the First Amendment in our Bill of Rights? What was their purpose for putting the Second Amendment in our Bill of Rights? You hear all kinds of claims made out there from people at all different levels of society, even people that's elected as representatives. Many of them will say, well, the Second Amendment is only intended for you to be able to hunt or maybe defend yourself from a burglar. And that's simply not the case, because our founders, that was not even in their mind remotely having to do with that. So, but I do want to address that, because that is a common question asked. Well, we can't all have nuclear bombs. Well, of course we can't. Of course we can't all afford them either. But I hope to address that better later. But want to try and get through finishing the declaration that we're going through right now. So, I don't remember if I'd made it all the way through this. I may have read it all. But I guess it was this last point where she raised that question. Said, he is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, and is combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. As we had learned earlier in our history, for hundreds of years, it had been recognized that it was an evil and oppressive government that would surround the citizenry with a standing army for the means of controlling them. It had nothing to do with protecting them from outside forces. They were simply used to control them. I know it can even be contentious today to mention that, for 250 years, our sheriff's departments and our police departments were not that well armed and were able to uphold the law in this country to protect our liberties, which was what they were designed for. Not until the early 1900s did we see both the tendency to encourage the citizenry to not be as armed as the government is, but in response also to see our local and state and even federal agencies being armed more like a military would be, with their same weaponry and same armaments, same tactics. That they do that saying that, well, it's so they could protect us. And they do use that for that sometimes, but I also hope to get to show you how, just like any other government, whether it's a king, oligarchy, or dictator, or even a republic, when given an excessive amount of power, the tendency is to abuse that power. There was also a reason why, the Constitution lays out that it's our Congress alone that has the power to fund the military. And it is our Congress as well that only has the power to declare war, to call up that military to be used to defend this country. But they also designed it to where in those times of war, it was a president and not a general that was to be the commander-in-chief over our military, as a way to be a safeguard that we would not get a military coup, so to speak, that we've seen even in recent history in local countries just to our south. You get a military leader as the national leader, and he tends to use the military to abuse the powers that they have and end up using that to control the people. That was a great fear that was in their minds that that would happen here. That's why they chose to place a civilian as the head over the military when the military was to be used to defend our country. Also subjecting them to foreign jurisdiction. That was where, if you were a troublemaker and you spoke out against the king, you would be arrested. And they came up with a good idea because they knew the British subjects had constitutional rights even before our revolution. And their constitution granted them the right to due process and trial by jury of their peers. Well, they would circumvent that by shipping them off to Quebec, which was another British colony, but one that they were allowed to keep French law. They didn't have the right there to be subject to due process or trial by jury, so they circumvented that right for the good of the crown, of course. We see that done today in the name of the war on terror or the war on drugs. We have a FISA court that is answerable to no one. It's in secret. We've had citizens taken to places, locations that nobody knows of without any due process. We've slowly come to a point to where now we have to prove our innocence rather than the government at any level has to prove a guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But we've also even had a couple of our Supreme Court justices make comments that when they decide on how they should write their opinions on certain legal issues in the court, you don't hear any of them, I haven't in a very long time heard any of them say, well, the Constitution dictates this or that. It's either precedent, or I've even heard them cite UN law and ideas from other countries. Our form of government declares that is unconstitutional, yet they do it. They even make treaties. They call them UN treaties that we've agreed to that totally disregard our Bill of Rights. So he gives his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. So, like the example given, when the people petitioned the king, well, we don't have representation in Parliament. And he said, oh yes, we've got volunteers for you that represent you for the colonists. And they said, no, that's pretended legislation because they're writing laws that none of them ever have to live under, and they don't answer to us. So this is one of, remember, this is a list of grievances of why the colonists felt they had the moral and legal obligation and right to separate themselves from the king. Next slide. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. We're going to learn, when I finally get start talking about certain individuals that helped bring about our revolution, we're going to learn that there was a lot of civilian British subjects killed by the government troops. And of course, you know, that at first they pretended to abide by the laws and the constitution of the colonies by having trials. Of course, they were mock trials. They were never punished or found guilty. But we don't have that happening anymore either. And we're going to actually learn about at least two of them. Therefore, imposing taxes on us without our consent. I can't think of any examples of that either. For depriving us, in many cases, the benefits of trial by jury. Does anything come to anybody's mind of any of these happening today? For transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. You mean they made up claims just to get people to shut up? They sure did. And if they didn't, this is what happens. And I heard this week that some of the European Russian nations have started enforcing their wonderful communist laws that they have, and that if the media is tells a story that sheds bad light on the particular form of government, that they can legally now say, okay, you've got 2 days to retract your story. If you don't, we can arrest you. There's people, representatives in this country, pushing for the same type of laws. Of course, it starts as political correctness. And then get enough people bought into political correctness, and well, see, just being politically correct is not stopping this bad behavior. They're saying things that we don't want to hear. So we need more teeth to our laws to make them stop. That was one of the reasons they fought against British. Yes, ma'am.
If they are going to enforce that today, what are they going to do with Facebook and all of that kind of thing? Because people get on there and voice their opinions.
You don't realize that Facebook and Google already do this?
Yeah, they do.
They suppress. They remove content. Because they're in the same pocket, of the same mind. You can't even say they're American companies anymore, because the founders of both of those companies they don't consider themselves American citizens. They don't even live here anymore. They have their own, you could say their own island. They're a private entity too, though. I mean, they're not subject to the same restrictions that our government is restricted by for suppressing speech. But they do. Although a lot of people think, when you hear it discussed from the other side, you know, if a Christian wants to say something, then it's okay for a private company to suppress that speech, even though the Constitution does not address that, not the U.S. Constitution. But if somebody else on the other side wants to say something and we raise a flag, say, that's offensive to us, you have no power to stop us from saying that here. I work at a company that occasionally has meals, group meals for the company. And it's gotten to the point to where upper management from Houston come into town to visit during one of these meals. And this, I believe, occurred before I went to work there, but the same mentality has carried through. That the area manager there asked for a prayer before the meal. Well, after that, one of the VPs from Houston took him to his office and railed him up one side and down the other. Said, "We will not do that here." So it's everywhere, and we can either choose to comply.
Did your manager comply?
Yep.
That's the problem. We need more data that will say, I'm gonna pray regardless of what you say. Make whatever law you wanna make, but I'm gonna continue to pray. You scream at me and holler at me one time, I'm still gonna preach the truth. I mean, get mad, stone me to death, I'm still gonna preach the truth. I mean, it's time we started taking on that mindset, because this whole business of placating and trying to quote unquote get along is destroying our ability to advance the cause of Christ. We really need to stand up, not and be ugly, but just be firm. We're not going to take that anymore.
Absolutely. Well, there's several of us that do not quietly comply. But
I don't understand that. I'm just saying that what you're citing here happens across the board. Rather than stand our ground, we just let the forces of evil, however, whatever minority they may represent, rule the day. I'm like, it's insane. What we're allowing to happen is insane. Because there's no law that allows them to do that. There's no precedent to allow them to do that. There's no driving majority force to it. There's just this perception that people like me, they get mad at me. Who cares? I mean, I guess I'm going to stay alive. I don't care if people like me or not. You just got to do what you know is right. But I mean, right is right, wrong is wrong. And if somebody says you can't do that anymore, I'm sorry you feel that way, but you have to kill me. I'm going to continue to do it. I mean, I'm not going to stop because you don't like it.
yeah. Well,
Fire me, I'm going to continue to do it.
we have in fact allowed the narrative to be stolen by the other side. Whether we're talking about in the church, whether we're talking about out in our local communities, at work, and we've definitely let the narrative be stolen by those that represent us in government. And that's
they'll sing the squeaky wheel.
absolutely.
Whoever makes the most racket usually gets their way. Anywhere, even in a church, that happens.
Yeah.
And you got to, that's where we lost our way in America, is the fact that too many squeaky wheels that don't know what they're talking about most of the time get their way, and everybody has to pay punishment or get the dues that come from whatever decision is made on that part.
Yeah. Well, just like in this history I went through, those evil and oppressive leaders know their history. They know what has been effective in the past and what is not. Well, for at least 40 years of my life, I know the mentality has been, well, in public, or even in some families, we can't speak about politics or religion. That was a quiet or soft, tyrannized way of suppressing free speech. And we've gone along with it to some extent or another. The other side noticed that. They said, we've got them quieted down. Now we need to speak up, even if we're a minority. Now we will sound louder. And they have. Yes, sir.
We need to recognize whatever our government, our president may or may not be thankful for the freedoms we do have, but there's never a more oppressive government than the Roman government during the days of the apostolic age. Yet Paul writes that every soul be subject to the higher powers. There is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Therefore, when you resist the power, you resist the ordinance of God. They that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not terror to good works, For he beareth not the sword in vain, but is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So here in the face of an oppressive government, Paul talks about what God ordained his government to be. That's what we need to be praying for, that our government be what God ordained, so that his people can live a quiet and peaceable life, as Paul said in 1 Timothy 1.
Absolutely. Just like when, Israel lived under its own government, and we have more insight into God's feeling about that through the Old Testament scripture than we would through the Roman Empire. But even with Israel, when they lived under, because God through his prophet told them when they asked for a king, okay, I'll give you a king, but you're going to regret it. Because, God should have been their king and should be our king. And the oppression that the Christians in the first century had to live through were not oppressions because of necessarily what the Christians did or didn't do. But they lived in a society in which God had come to the point that he was going to punish them. Everybody. And just like Israel, when they were carried off into captivity, even those that were living as God commanded, suffered greatly the consequences of the society that they lived in that had turned away from God. Same with the Romans. And I believe wholeheartedly the same with us. That the oppressions that we feel right now from the ungodly people that are in power are not necessarily because of us, though I think indirectly they are. If we have failed to do what God has commanded us to do, to live the way we're supposed to live, and to obey the Great Commission that we were given, that because of that, our society has turned into what it has turned into. And though God gave us, through providence, a form of government that would protect our liberties and help us to flourish as a nation, which we did, but that if we reach a point to where we as Christians have neglected to do our due diligence and duty, then we as well are going to suffer the consequences. You had a comment?
Essentially, the Romans 13 passage was written by one who, no doubt, Nero was emperor when he wrote Romans 13. But it was that same Nero that had Paul's head cut off because Paul wouldn't kowtow to an oppressive government that said, stop preaching the gospel. And so he wouldn't stop because the government told him to stop, and they killed him. But his death, like so many others, according to Fox and others, was the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the kingdom. It was that unwillingness to bow down to political correctness, or whatever you want to call it, oppression. It was that unwillingness to give in. It was the desire to be like Daniel, the desire to obey God rather than man, that turned that Roman world up on the side of its head. I mean, it went from being a pagan society to a quote-unquote Christianized culture. Unfortunately, an out of form, but nevertheless, I think that's what I'm suggesting here is that, we certainly don't want to be rabble-rousers, we don't want to be protesters, but at the same time, we need to stop letting corporate CEOs and governors and mayors and presidents and Supreme Courts tell us, you can't live the Christian life. You can't do what you should do as a Christian. And the fact we keep giving in because we want to just get along is hurting the cause of Christ, not helping. I mean, I think in the back of our mind, we think if we're just nice to everybody, we're just meek and quiet and don't say anything, well then, eventually people see how nice we are and they want to be. It doesn't work that way. I mean, at some point you got to say, you're not going to stop me from praying. You're not going to stop me from going to church. You're not going to stop me from preaching the truth. And if the government says do it, we pray for that government and then we let the government do what they're going to do to us. But at the same time, it's an interesting thing when you think about Paul, because it kind of illustrates both of what's being said here. We have to respect the government at the same time. Ultimately, we can't allow the government to override
Yes. Well, I want to respond to that without trying to let the cat out of the bag too badly on where I'm trying to end up. But I mentioned several times that our rebellion against Great Britain was actually a legal process. It was done through legal means. It was actually done in accordance to the British Constitution that they lived under. Did it lead to bloodshed and war? Absolutely. But who shed the blood first? Whose response was against the Constitution that they were under and the natural law that they were under? So our first Civil War was a legal process where one side behaved tyrannically, ungodly, and unconstitutionally at the time, under the Constitution they had. Now I got a question for you to ponder, because you've brought this point up several times. Our second Civil War, was it also done with a legal process?
Done tyrannically.
Well, one side is always going to react tyrannically, but even what instigated the tyrannical response, was it done according to the Constitution?
South Carolina said, this is our fort. We can get your troops out of here.
So through all history that we went over to, even when the kings with a sword at their throat agreed to sign, okay, this is what we promise to never do again. These are rights that you have. Did that piece of paper stop future kings from breaking those promises?
No.
Our Bill of Rights and our U.S. Constitution is a piece of paper on ink. Does that guarantee that we will never have to fight for our rights? Now, if we were to speak out against our government in the way that it's behaving, notice I'm not speaking of, I didn't put it in a context of a particular subject, but just speaking out against our government, would that be going against God?
You're trying to come right before the power and said you're not doing the right thing. So we have that right. Freedom of speech gives us that right. But we should do it in humility.
Yes. But also legally speaking. That's why I didn't mention what the context of what we're speaking out against. But depending on what we're speaking out against, we actually have a moral and a legal right and obligation to do so. Even if we're labeled troublemakers and terrorists by the government. The Constitution gives us that right, our obligation. So, because you'll hear the rhetoric from those who embrace tyranny. Well, we're the government, and we have the power to tell you what to do. You claim to believe in God, and God tells you to obey your government. Well, you need to do what I say. Or as one of our youngest members of Congress here recently said, I'm the boss. If you're not going to do it, I'm going to tell you to do it. But we're going to find out through the words at the end of this what price that could be. All right, next line. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governance. Taking away our charters. Now, they were speaking of the charters of the colonies at the time that the king threatened to do to them if they would not just willingly comply to whatever the king says. It could be substituted with, well, if you're not preaching what we want you to preach, we're going to remove your tax-free status as a church. Abolishing our most valuable laws. Or the recognition of life. Altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. I remember hearing a president not long ago state his outright goal was to fundamentally transform the United States. And he didn't mean it in a way to transform it towards more liberty like our founders figured that we would as we matured as a nation.
He meant what he said.
Absolutely. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So that this is talking about the legislatures in the colonies being suspended by the king or by Parliament. But this could very well be our own form of the crown, the federal government suspending the powers of the state legislatures.
They do it all the time.
And declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. I wouldn't bore you with going through the actual Constitution reading, okay, this article gives this particular power in this section to this particular branch of government. But I encourage you all to take the time to read it. Article 1 has to do with the powers of the legislature. Article 2, the powers of the executive branch and the president. Article 3 is the powers delegated to the court system, including the Supreme Court. And the other articles after that dealing with elections and other things. All of which would enlighten us all as to the mess that they have woven a web in Washington over. Those were specific powers delegated, not surrendered, but delegated by the states to the federal government. That means if you're a parent and you tell your child, I want you to go into the store and I want you to buy a Snickers and a Coke and bring me the change back. And they go into the store, they buy a beer and a pack of cigarettes and they keep the change. And you do nothing to that child. What are they going to do next time? That wasn't what you told them to do. They didn't have the authority to do that. But they took that authority upon themselves. And why wouldn't they if there's no punishment for it? We have a whole pile of spoiled little children that's up in Washington, D.C. that does just that. Except they're the kind of child that when you try and discipline them, they'll ball their fist up at you and hit you. Because they've gotten away with it for so long. And it doesn't matter what the law is or what the case is. Who does everybody go run to find out, well, is that constitutional or not? They run to the Supreme Court. And another point was made that I caught this week. you have these people that speak out, that protest our nation and our federal government. But then what do they turn to? Well, I'm going to the Supreme Court to settle this matter. Well, I thought you hate them and protest them. But that's who you want to decide the issue, even if it's an issue they have no authority over. That's called arbitrary. And we're going to speak a lot on that. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. Bless you. I think, nationally speaking, and it's only one instance, up until recently, we didn't have anybody in the government that would stand up and say that Christians are a protected right and privilege in this country. Actually, their action speaks the other way. You know, I have my own issues with President Trump, but I have been surprised at some of the actions that he's taken. One of them is the recognition of Christianity. Don't know how sincere it is, but he seems sincere, more so than anybody else.
Did you see the way the news media covered his trip to Alabama where they were ravaged with the tornadoes? And several of the citizens came out and he was signing the covers of their Bibles. And the news media was absolutely slamming him for doing that. Because he's trying to minimize their suffering and he's writing in Bible when people really need help and he's checking the government don't need that kind of stuff.
How many other representatives were there?
I don't know. It just sickens me to hear what's happening with the way this is covered. I don't know if the man's sincere or not. That's not my place to judge. I just know that there's nothing wrong with the president, trying to comfort some family that lost their house or their loved ones in a terrible storm. If they ask him to sign their Bible, why would he not do that? I mean, it's just, I don't understand. It's just so far gone. The media's being sued right now. That group that was harangued by that
Yeah.
Native American, if you want to call him that, hippie, that poor teenager, he has a lawyer now suing CNN for $240 million.
It's not just
That's
CNN.
one way to legally fight back and say, we're not going to, because that we understand the media is really an arm of the state, state media.
Is that a new thing?
No, it's not. But we need to fight back. We need to say, hey, we can't let you just run over us like that because that's ridiculous.
You would get a kick out of reading what Thomas Jefferson thought about newspapers in his day when he was president. He basically called them nothing good except for a fish wrap. Nothing but lies. Next slide, please. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. How much can you think of, just from what I can remember, over the last 30 years in particular, I guess. I haven't cared about politics much longer than that. Think of any presidents or representatives that this could describe? That they behave like barbarians, and that it's unbelievable that they would actually be a representative of a civilized nation with the things that they say and the things that they do. King George was no different. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. Or maybe arrested or interviewed because of a FISA application of a court case against a particular individual and questioned over items that have nothing to do what supposedly that FISA warrant was to find out, with the sole intent and purpose to find something that they may have done wrong, with the hopes that they'd lie or roll over and say something about somebody else that they want to entrap. That's no different. Next slide. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. It could easily be said, maybe he encouraged those outside our borders to come here illegally to do the same thing. And actually, maybe even give them the arms to do so. Not a president of the United States and his executive branch would not willingly arm known bad people. Ever heard of Fast and Furious? I know a lot can be said about what President Obama did and didn't do. But what about the Bushes? Did you know George Bush sent millions of dollars south of the border for advertisements telling those people how to come here and take advantage of our system? Both sides do it. Maybe next week I'll get through it. Thank you for your attention.
We're not very politically correct in our declaration, are we?
No?